Good evening and welcome to Dessert and Dish. Dessert and Dish is our weekly interview segment where we invite real people to dish on the real challenges and the real blessings of living faithful lives. We always feature a dessert at Dessert and Dish, and we try to have something local or homemade, although it's not going to be local or homemade tonight. I always find personally that dessert makes good conversations all that much better, and I think that we're always needing a little reminder of the sweetness of the kingdom of God already at work in our midst. I'm really happy this evening to welcome Archdeacon Val Kerr, who is joining us for tonight's conversation, and my co-host, Reverend Scott McLeod. And before I say a little bit more about Scott and Val, we do need to introduce dessert. That's exceptionally important. Like I said, this week isn't homemade or local per se, but it is personal. So both my sister-in-law, Julie, and my goddaughter, Ivy, are both involved in Girl Guides. And they've had a little bit of trouble selling their cookies in a pandemic because, you know, a lot of their means of getting cookie sales out there have evaporated. I was really glad that they both reached out to me to buy cookies nonetheless. And so these are your cookies now. They're the mint ones. They're really good. Girl Guides are known for their cookies. You can open them up. You can take them home. And I hope you enjoy Girl Guide cookies.
Thank you. And thank you to Julie and Ivy.
Yeah. Yes, and you're a very good supporter.
Well, I try. It's like a dirty job, but somebody's got to buy the cookies.
Yeah.
Somebody's got to share the cookies. So yeah, enjoy the cookies.
Definitely.
Okay, so I want to give a little bit more introduction now to Scott and to Val, now that we've introduced the cookies. For those of you who are familiar with our St. George's congregation, you're probably familiar both with Scott and Val as well, but we never know exactly who's joining us online, so a little bit more information is always helpful. Scott is my colleague in ministry here at St. George's. You might say he's kind of my partner in crime and fellow priest here in this church. And Val also has a very long and faithful relationship here at St. George's. You might say that you're the reason why I came to St. George's. Val was the associate priest and then vice rector here at St. George's for many, many years. We're longtime friends, going back, I think we met 20 years ago when we were both just at the start of our seminary days. Mm-hmm. And so when I had the opportunity to consider working with you here at St. George's, it was a really big draw.
And boy, did we have plans, eh?
We had plans, and we did work together for a little bit, and then you went on to do other things. And one of those things that you went on to do was to become the Archdeacon of Truth and Reconciliation and Indigenous Ministries in the Diocese of Niagara, and that started 5 years ago, is that right?
Yeah.
2016?
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's you've had big things on your plate, and just this past year, you've come back to St. George's as an honorary assistant. Everybody's so thrilled here at St. George's about that, but we just haven't had a lot of time to hang out yet.
No.
Because of COVID. So this is a big, exciting thing to get to be together.
We haven't had time for ice cream.
Oh my gosh. Well, it's ice cream season, so
yeah.
I hope you're not disappointed I didn't bring ice cream instead.
Well, I thought of it, but it's pretty warm for ice cream.
It would be
keep.
Like the storage piece would be tricky. More milkshake.
Yes.
We could have had milkshakes, yeah. So Val, can you share with us just a little bit about your background and a little bit about your work over the past 5 years as Archdeacon in this diocese?
I can. Wow, I don't know where these past 5 years have gone. April of 2016, I was totally blown away when Bishop Michael Bird called me and shared with me what he was wanting to do in appointing me the Archdeacon of Truth, Reconciliation and Indigenous Ministry for the diocese. And at that time, I was full-time in a parish.
Yeah.
And so I took it on because I have a passion. I have a passion for my culture, for my people. And I have a passion around justice and healing,
Yeah.
which has been a very important part of my life.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I did manage it for, I don't know, about 2-3 years. And it got to the point where it was just too much
To do both.
to do both.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So because I was 3 Sundays a month I was in the parish, and then 1 Sunday a month was to be out and about. But that put pressure both on me and the parish because they had to have somebody to fill in for me. So what I've been about, I start, like, as far as we knew or know, it was the first appointment of its kind. Now, since then, there have been several other appointments that we know of. And I think one of the next ones that was Melanie Delva, who is the animator for
Truth and reconciliation. Yeah, for the national church.
for the national church. And then, of course, most recently is Roz at Six Nations.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So that was pretty exciting to see Roz, and she's in the Diocese of Huron.
Right.
And there is a person in Ottawa as well. But as far as that goes, that's all I know of. So it was a completely new position, and we kind of had to figure it out as we went along. And because I have a long association with Kairos, probably since the inception of the blanket exercise, Ed Bianchi said. He did, because we had a conference one year and we were trying to do a timeline, and I said to Ed, I said, do you remember when we did this? And he said, that was kind of almost the first time we did the blanket exercise.
That goes back at least 20
Yeah.
years, more than that?
Yeah. Yes, definitely. It was before I went to seminary.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So we did Ellie Johnson and I did a conference for equipping ambassadors for reconciliation.
Wow.
And we had people from all over Canada come. It was a residential conference. And when we talked about how we might begin the conference, the blanket exercise came to me because it's an interactive teaching tool that gives us a basis.
Yeah, yeah.
A basis of the history of Canada as Europeans came into the country.
Because as we know, that history there have been some gaps in how that history is being taught. For
Absolutely.
Sure. Big gaps.
Big gaps.
Yeah.
I found that out when my youngest went to school, and he came home one day and he said to me, Mommy, you're not an Indian, are you?
Wow.
I said, well, actually, I am Indigenous. And he looked at me and he said, but you don't have a bow and arrow.
Oh, gosh.
So that's when I learned what they were teaching the children in school. And so I think that always stuck with me. And I'm a firm believer in the truth. And so I made it my business to educate myself.
Yeah, yeah.
Educating myself was a big part of the journey, because for whatever reason, our parents decided that, well, we moved off the reserve when I was 7, but they also decided it was better that we didn't practice our cultural
Okay,
traditions.
so you really had to reclaim,
Yeah,
do a lot of education and reclaiming.
absolutely. And I'm still doing reclaiming.
Yeah, no doubt.
It's an ongoing process because I'm a lifelong learner. I love to learn, and I'm passionate. I'm passionate about children and youth, and so I've been involved in all kinds of things. And I also love to teach.
Well, and I think those two things are really connected, and I think that's what has made you such a good teacher and such a good leader in terms of teaching others, is that you yourself are continuing to learn. I mean, I think it's hard to be a good teacher if you're not committed to learning.
Well, if you kind of think you've learned it all, I think we're all in trouble.
Yeah. Finished product over here.
Yeah, right. And you know what I like best teaching people is when I could have a group of people together and get them to stand in a circle and just walk around. Just walk around in that circle, and then it's so evident that we're both leaders and followers.
Oh, yeah.
And so I like to point that out to people. And that's how our communities traditionally would be run.
Right.
Because generation after generation, we learn from each other. And while the elders would care for the children, while the hunter-gatherers were out hunting and gathering, the elders and the children learned from each other.
Yeah.
And then the parents would come home and they'd sit around the fire and they'd talk about what they were doing. And so, you know, our children, that's how our children were taught.
Yeah, not a one-way street.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
And that everybody in the community was important. Everybody had a role, from the youngest to the eldest.
Yeah.
I remember meeting an Anishinaabe elder at the Fort White Center in Winnipeg. My parents both grew up in, we have family still in Winnipeg, so we were there visiting, and we took, Sue and I took our son to Fort White, and the elder who's on staff there and works offering teaching was doing a session, and he made a point of pointing out that there was a child in the midst and just how important that was, and everything that you just said. So it's and yet, you know, with everything that's been going on, especially the tragic revelation of the last few weeks, the challenges, I guess, that settler culture has in approaching relationship with children in the same way. And especially with approaching, well, first talking about education and re-educating, relearning the history of what has happened with residential schools, and the stories that have been told by survivors for years about what's happened, and yet, you know, I guess there's been that level of disbelief, like, oh, well, they're saying it, but, you know, there's no evidence, and then now we have hard, concrete proof that all of those stories were true.
Yeah.
And so, insofar, I think, as you know, we would like to think that we all treat children in the way that you were just talking about with that teaching. It's clearly evidence that that's not what's happened. So, I mean, I think everybody's just been reeling. I can't even imagine what some families are facing. But you know, what have you been hearing, and what, you know, coming out of this, or rather moving through it, you know, is there that sense that people are paying more attention now, and because we're being faced again, and then anew, again with the history of the residential schools, it was maybe seeming to go quiet, but then anew with new revelations about just how bad it really is.
Wow. How do I talk about it? My heart hurts. My heart hurts because you're right, for generations, survivors have been telling their stories, and for generations, those stories have been falling on deaf ears. Deaf ears. And you know, part of me could say, well, I suppose people didn't want it to be true. But you're right, now we have concrete proof. And as you know from my cultural background, we're storytellers. And one of the things that I took part in after this came out was something that was offered by Reconciliation Canada, which I've been a part of probably for actually longer than I realized when I seen the date. But they do really good work. It's an Indigenous community that runs the programs, and they're out west. And they did a series, and I did send it out to as many people as I could. But one of the teachings, and that was the good thing about the series they did. It wasn't about pointing fingers, you know, trying to say, oh, well, I didn't have anything to do with that. It was about sharing teachings. And it was wonderful. They had different speakers on. Of course, it was done online because of COVID, but they had different speakers. But one speaker really touched my heart with her teaching that she had been given. And because, of course, we talked about the children and what had been found. And she said the teaching that she was given was that for all these generations, Mother Earth has been looking after these children. Mother Earth has been embracing them and caring for them. And so as I sat with that, in my mind, I even took it a step further to say, and now the children are speaking out.
Oh, wow.
And now the children are speaking out. And I believe the children are speaking out and calling us to action. You know, our voices have been silent long enough.
Yeah. Wow.
So I don't need to tell you that I was overwhelmed with messages and calls and requests, and I'm still overwhelmed with requests, especially with National Indigenous Day and then National Indigenous Month for the country. And how do we celebrate a country when they've done so much damage to a people who were here when they arrived? So there's lots of struggles. There's lots of struggles internally and externally.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm really aware of, like, we're both involved with Archbishop Mark MacDonald's Living Waters group, Pimatsawinipi. And I'm really aware of our last meeting with him, which was before any of these revelations. And the picture that he painted from Indigenous communities right now, especially during COVID, like, the word he used was apocalyptic. He said, like, there are forest fires, there are droughts, there are floods, there are youth suicides, there is ramped up addiction, there is isolation, there's lack of resources, and a ton of Indigenous elders have been lost in the past year and a half. He said that, you know, the leaders that he works most closely with are barely hanging on. They're just in absolute crisis mode. And I mean, my heart was broken hearing that. And that was before all of these fresh revelations of trauma and atrocity.
Yeah.
I guess, what are you hearing from Indigenous networks, and what do Canadians need to know?
Well, I think most Canadians are aware of the fact that we have a lot of communities that do not even have clean water. And, it just, come on, folks. This is Canada. It's not a third world country. We fight to get water to third world countries, and I've been involved in some of that too.
Yeah.
But here we are right in Canada, and not everyone has access to clean water. Part of that is because in the remote areas it's hard, and we have learned a lot about the hardships of trying to get water into those remote communities, the isolation of those communities, also the housing of those communities, because housing, it's had a huge effect, COVID, on our communities because of lack of housing, lack of good housing.
Yeah.
But I have to tell you, lack of any kind of housing.
Yeah.
I'll share a story only because it was in the news, but there was a woman in a northern community who had 3 children, I believe it was. She was pregnant with twins. And a friend that she knew offered to let her live in his laundry room. So that's where she was living with her children. And when it came time for her to have her twins, she had to be flown out. She had to give her children up to Family and Children's Services. And the hard thing about that is we never know if we're going to get them back.
Yeah.
But because she was going to be out of the community to have her babies, she had no one to look after them.
Oh my gosh.
So the lack of housing, that's how desperate it is. It's, many families living in one home. And how do you distance?
Well, that's right. I mean, when we were beginning to explore options for clean water in Pikangikum, we were told that equipping one house could make a difference to 10 to 12 people, 3 to 4 generations.
Yep.
That's just kind of par for the course.
Yeah. That's the reality that Indigenous people live with every day. And it's interesting because when I was a child, there was one source of good water in our community, and that was at the post office. They had an outdoor pump, right, to a well. And because we didn't know, or my parents didn't know what the water was like on the property, there was a well on our property, but we weren't allowed to drink the water.
Yeah.
And growing up as a child, you don't really think about it. But I remember my dad, loading big barrels into the back of a truck and then going down and filling those barrels up with water so we would have water to drink.
At the post office.
At the post office. Imagine. And I know I'm a little older than you guys, but I'm not that old yet.
You're not that old.
I have to tell you a funny story, though. When we moved off reserve into the city, my brother and I were so excited to have a bathtub with running water. We put our bathing suits on and went in the tub. The resilience of children, and that's, and that's in other communities as well. I think that, I feel anyway, that we were fortunate to be born where we were born, because the reserve that I come from is only 11 miles from the city. When I look at the northern communities and how isolated they are and what they have to deal with on a daily basis, and when we learn about residential schools and the intergenerational trauma, you know, I think people are learning. And I have to say, as in these last 5 years, as I've went around teaching, people have been like, really? How come we didn't learn this? I actually had a group at Western, and I did some teaching with them, and there was a young woman, when we were doing our sharing circle, she was just bouncing in her seat, waiting for that. At that point, I was using a rock, right? Waiting for that rock to come to her. And when she finally got it, she jumped up and she said, I'm a history major. Why have I not learned this history?
Yeah. Well, and I mean, I was just talking to a friend about this today because, like, for whatever reason, we did learn about the history where I grew up, and that might have just been like a particular teacher who was passionate about the truth. But what we didn't learn about is how the history is still with us. Like, we didn't learn about the ongoing effects and trauma, and we certainly didn't learn about lack of drinking water and the gross injustices that are baked into our system. We didn't learn about that.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of learning that there's a lot of gaps.
There's a lot of gaps.
A lot of gaps.
I have to tell you what I said to that young woman when she asked that question, why haven't I learned this history? You know, what could I say? I just looked at her and I said, who wrote the books?
Yeah, that's the thing.
The high school that I went to in Victoria was unique because in partnership with local nations, there was can't remember the exact title, Indigenous Studies program. So there was 4 Indigenous youth teachers who were also elders, and specific teachings and opportunities. But as a student that also went to that school, outside of that, we weren't taught that ongoing piece, and we only got what was in the books. And so even though it was right there was only bits and pieces. And which I don't think any fault of the people running that program, certainly not the students or anybody. It's just the system at the time. I'm sure those teachers were constrained, all other kinds of things going on, but same thing. So even when it was that close, and so now as an adult, knowing because later on when I was first working in the church, the first congregation that I was actually the rector for was very close to the Esquimalt Nation, it just, so even though I went to high school in that same community, I didn't know what came out later, what I learned later, right there, right in the middle of the community. It's astounding now.
I've actually had people tell me that they lived right next door to a residential school and didn't realize what it was.
Yeah.
And let's remember, our last residential school didn't close until 1996.
That's right.
Yeah, which...
And they started, like, over 100 years.
Yeah.
This has been going on. And
I mean, that is astonishing to me to think that when I was in high school, residential schools were still open. Like, that was still a thing.
Yeah.
Like, that is wild.
When I was in seminary, working with a friend of mine, Well, actually, a couple of friends talked about Vivian Seegers a couple weeks ago, and so I was in seminary with Vivian. So our other friend Emily put together an opportunity for youth in the Anglican context to go and visit a partner organization in Guatemala, and it was a great experience, wonderful experience. And while we were there, the youth hit up one of the community leaders with the question of, we've learned all this, in the couple weeks that we've been here about your situation, the plight of Guatemalans, especially, indigenous Guatemalans in the highlands. And so they inevitably asked the question, what can we do to help? And so this amazing community leader, he responded by saying, the best thing you can do is you can go home and you can fix the problems in Canada.
Wow.
And because of that connection between him and my friend Emily, basically he was more informed about the plight of First Nations people in Canada than these youth that we brought down there. And so that insight being passed on, like, you need to go home to fix your problems, and that will help us here. And yet, they're ongoing. The same clean water problems, the same housing problems that were existent early 2000s are not that much better now, incrementally, but not much.
Can I just talk a little bit about education?
Yeah, please.
Education is so important. And we can try to educate people as much as we want. However, until the truth is told, we can't start our journey of reconciliation. The truth must be told. Genocide has happened. Colonization is still happening. I went to a conference a couple of years ago, just before, like the year before COVID, and it was in Ottawa. It was excellent. It was through the school board, so a lot of teachers, and I was so impressed with the information they shared. And you had to, part of the afternoon was signing up for one of the presentations, and the one I had signed up for was full, so they asked me to take another one. So the one I chose, it was called something like, it was something about moccasins. So I thought, okay, maybe we're gonna learn how to make moccasins. Boy, was I wrong. Totally wrong. There was moccasins being made. But what I learned at that workshop was that a group of people had done some research, and research of especially the hospitals out west that were in close proximity to reserves and indigenous, with a lot of indigenous population. And so what they found out was that there were at least 40 children a day being taken from indigenous mothers and fathers. And when she started the presentation, she said, we thought 40 children. And she said, then we learned after that was just one hospital. That was just one hospital. And we've all heard in the news about families having their children taken at birth, and the reasonings being things like they don't have any parenting skills. Well, folks, how come our young people don't have any parenting skills when our children were taken out of the communities and they never had the opportunity to learn those parenting skills that...
Because they weren't parented.
Exactly, yeah. They weren't parented. Exactly. So you know where the moccasins come in that workshop? This group, this is really hard to say. This group makes baby moccasins. and they're sent to hospitals. And at least the children that are being taken have one thing from their culture to take with them. So, do we wonder why our communities are reeling? Do we wonder why, just after years and years of carrying these burdens of the stories of residential schools and the experience of residential schools, I believe it's killing our elders. You know, along with the COVID, of course, because we know just last week another one of our people died, right? And people who work in our communities work so hard. And it's really hard to say because Martha and Scott, you were at that the clergy conference this past week, and there's always these side conversations going on in the chat room, right? And there was that day, and I didn't even think to check to see if this was to everyone, but I know what I said went to everyone, and because somebody was talking about the church and what the news that had come out. And I said, one of our elders said, "You promised to bring us Jesus Christ, but instead you brought the church." And that was where the damage started. It was, I think it had started before that because we had already had Europeans coming into the country, and they came to a country that was so rich with all kinds of things.
Yeah.
And they had to find a way of assimilating the people that were here. And what they realized was that with adults, it was harder to assimilate adults than children. So they decided that was the way to assimilate, was to take the children and take the Indian out of the child.
Yeah, and that was very explicitly said.
Very explicitly, because they had tried the smallpox blankets, right? We learned about that too. And I'm sure people think, oh, that really couldn't have happened. But believe me, it did happen because we have proof. We have a name of a person who delivered those blankets, you know, and we have proof in our communities of intergenerational trauma.
Yeah, you do.
And what we're taught is that we have blood memories. And so even though we personally may not have attended a residential school, I had a grandmother that did. And we carry their trauma with us. When my mother was carrying me, my grandmother was part of that too. And we learn that, right, from science.
Yeah, I know. It's like biological. It's not just a spiritual reality.
No.
It's a biological reality.
One of the things that I find so challenging, sort of the inverse of that, right? Like it is proven that we carry that in our genes, right? So carrying that trauma from your grandmother through to your mother, through to you, like we know that it's physical and manifests psychological, and because we're the church, we would say spiritual as well, right? We know that to be true, and yet there's this tendency, and always has been, and I remember listening to a CBC radio show. I remember it was Ian Hannamansing hosting, and they were talking about this is early 2000s revelation of residential schools, and the reactions of people, especially because they were talking about the church's involvement. And so that, what you were saying earlier about you promised us Jesus and you gave us the church, and just how true that is. But the complexity of the Indian Act, the residential school system, and everything. The whole colonial
Doctrine of
enterprise.
discovery.
Yeah, the doctrine of discovery is that it's not just one. It's everybody. It's everything.
Yeah.
Right? Like there's no piece of culture and society from that time that was not complicit.
Yeah.
Government, church, outside of the church, and yet, what I remember hearing in that show that Ian was hosting at the time, and the narrative that is up and down is it's those people. I wasn't alive then, didn't have anything to do with me. It's not my fault, not my problem. Don't blame me. Don't look to me for help. And I think one of the really challenging things is that the temptation, and then some things that we've heard is people like, oh, well, that church, the Roman Catholic Church, they were the ones who ran that school in Kamloops, so let's all point our fingers at them.
Yeah.
The Catholic Church, the Anglican Church, the Presbyterian Church, the United Church, it doesn't matter. All of the churches were involved, and the government.
Yeah.
The people who designed the system, and then everybody who lived. So like there is no finger to point unless you're pointing at yourself. So, and yet that seems to be so hard to learn.
It does. I think it's really hard for people to get their heads around. Like, how could I be responsible for something that I wasn't even born at the time that it happened? However, it's still going on today.
Yeah.
Our new residential schools we call the 60 Scoop. Right now, there's more Indigenous children in foster care than actually attended residential school. That means over 150 children. Now, I don't want, and this is very important to me, I don't want people to think that it's hopeless, because it's not hopeless. I truly believe it's not hopeless. In my heart of hearts, what I've learned is, yes, we do carry the trauma. We do carry the trauma, and I'm living proof of that. I am so, I'm so proud to be able to say to my children, we need to be so proud of being able to break the cycle of abuse.
Yeah.
That went on for generations. And in my family, I am so proud of that. So what I've also taken away from carrying our ancestors' trauma is that we also carry our ancestors' strength.
Yeah.
And we are a resilient people. We're strong. Look at the generations they've been trying to just, I don't care what you call it, whatever they thought they could do, they haven't been able to do. When I talk about education, a lot of people, when I'm teaching, don't realize that, because of the thing that I hear time and time again, oh, what do they want now? Why don't they just get over it?
I know, right?
Tell me, folks, those of you with children, how would you ever get over someone coming to your home and taking your children from you? Literally, in some cases, ripping them out of your arms.
Yeah. I mean, but the other piece in like that kind of why can't they just get over it, that is so missed is exactly what you just said, which is the strength, the resilience, the wisdom And when we're talking about responsibility, when we're talking about giving people a voice, what we need to understand is that we're all going to be blessed by that. Like, it's not, like, there's so much blessing to be unlocked in listening to people's voices who haven't been listened to.
I've said that, I say that wherever I go to teach. We have, all of us have something to teach.
Yeah.
Every one of us. And we can learn so much from each other.
Yeah.
And that's what I strive for. I don't teach because I want to point fingers, and I make that very clear. I'm not there to point fingers. I'm there to open up minds, to learn, and to embrace the learning that we do from each other. Our culture is so rich.
Yes.
Oh, do you know the teaching that happens just by pitching a teepee? Have you had that teaching? It's a wonderful teaching, and it's done in community, and everyone helps, and each pole is there for a reason.
Yeah.
Even when I do funerals, I talk about what we can learn from creation, about life, death, and resurrection.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
You know, it's a rich culture.
Yeah. And, you know, going back to what you said about parenting being a two-way street, like, I think we need to really think about responsibility as a two-way street. Like, it's not just there's no finger pointing going on. There's just the opportunity to, like, learn from one another.
Yeah.
Well, and to be responsible, to be accountable for the past, and to heal.
Yeah.
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 To tell the truth.
Tell the truth.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the truth is still with us.
You know, there's that old saying, right? The truth shall set you free.
Yeah.
Somebody said that somewhere, right?
I think so.
I think so.
Well, I can tell you what my boys say. Here goes another story. When they were young, a neighbor came to my door and said, I thought you might like to know that your boys were back in the field smoking. I said, oh, thank you very much. And of course, later on, they came in and they were looking for a snack probably or a drink, and they came in with their friends. And I said, okay, you guys, I have something to ask you. And they were all standing there. I said, who was smoking? Well, all the heads went down. I thought, nobody's going to take responsibility for this. However, my oldest boy finally spoke up and he said, Mom, I cannot tell a lie. We all were. So not only did he confess for himself, he confessed for everyone. Threw them under the bus. But it was something that I had instilled in my children, because I know what not telling the truth what happened to me as a result of that.
Yeah.
And so I instilled that, and they'll still say that. I mean, the worst thing you can do to me is tell me a lie. They knew that they would get in more trouble for not telling the truth than they would for whatever they did.
Yeah.
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 So it's those kinds of learnings and teachings we have to share. You know, we talk about love in the church all the time. Love your neighbor as yourself. It doesn't say, and that's from old scripture, the Old Testament, right? Mm-hmm. The Shema Israel. Mm-hmm. And so it's nothing new. And I always say, it doesn't say, love your neighbor if they believe like you, think like you, worship like you, are the same color as you are, you know, do the same things. It basically is very clear.
Yeah, it's not a nice suggestion. It's not a good idea. It's a command.
It's a command.
Yeah.
On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets.
Yeah.
And so, you know, one thing I think I should talk about is why I'm involved with the church.
Yeah. Yeah.
When the 215 came to light, one of my friends went on Facebook and made a very strong statement and removed her collar. And in standing in solidarity, I did the same thing, removed my collar. And I have to say, I will be surprised if we don't lose some of our people from working for the church because of this. But standing in solidarity, it doesn't mean that I'm going to turn my back on the church. I stand in solidarity to work for justice, to work for justice for those children. And we know it's only the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah.
Murray Sinclair feels the number he threw out there was like 10,000.
Oh, gosh.
So we have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of healing to do. But first, we have to accept the truth of what happened and what continues to happen in Canada. Our children, when I say our children, I'm talking about Indigenous children, receive at least 35% less funding for education than non-Indigenous children. And yet I go to do presentations and I have people saying, well, Indigenous people get everything.
I know.
Sorry, folks, you need to look at the treaties. The only reason I believe that our children get that much funding is because those treaties are living documents.
Right.
As long as the wind blows and the water flows.
Well, and let's be honest, you know, so we're talking about your grandkids and our kids.
Absolutely.
The difference there, right? And so you mentioned earlier during clergy conference, you had a number of people reaching out, and you had other people. I know I was one of them. You know, sent you messages after that revelation and got in touch. But then the question looms large. You know, okay, so I reached out to you, Val. So now what? Like that's not enough, right? Mm-hmm. So you know, there's that challenge. I think I always tongue-in-cheek call it sort of the sitcom solution approach, right? Like that initial response of like, okay, what can we do really fast and quick and easy, and we'll just tie it up in a nice bow in half an hour. But recognizing that there's actually a lot more that needs to be done, and trying to resist the urge of like, oh, I'll just go and fix and I'll go and do. You know, is there being careful of asking that question and turning it around, but are there things that you can share that somebody like me needs to hear about concrete things that can be done, concrete things that people who are part of our community at St. George's and in the wider Anglican Church, let alone the wider community, that we can do?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Tell the truth. You know, like those youth learn. And ask questions. Ask questions. I know people want to help. I know people's first reaction is, and we learned about this in water, right? Oh, we'll go and fix this. Well, there is no quick fix, like you said.
Yeah.
I have to say, one of our colleagues, when I made that statement about Jesus and the church, he actually sent me a message and said, you are very brave to say that. And I don't look at that as being brave. I look at that as being honest.
Right. Yeah.
Sorry. So what could people do if they're so moved to want to do something? Learn. Introduce yourself to an Indigenous person if you don't already know one. And I think some of you will be surprised to learn how many Indigenous people you already know.
Right.
because Indigenous people don't always self-identify because of the long history of racism, the long history of racism. Really get to know an Indigenous person and see how they live. I taped a segment for one of the private schools in, Oakville. Appleby.
Yeah.
And I've been there to talk to their youth a few times and to teach, but because of COVID, I couldn't go. So I decided this year what I was going to do was talk about my family, because a lot of people have this image of Indigenous people that is unfounded and very false.
Yeah.
So I talked about what some of my cousins do. And there's a lot of us, let me tell you. And I have to say, we were so blessed with a grandmother that taught us how to live a good life. And so I talked about in my family, and we're talking in my generation, we have a lawyer, we have several doctors, we have a lot of nurses, and a lot of teachers, both in the public school and other colleges and universities. We have people who are so talented. Even in my own family, I don't know what happened to me. Music. You should hear them, Martha.
You're very talented, I just have to say that. I can't let that go by.
But they're like, I say, how come you guys can't? You know, like even my auntie, I didn't even know she played. And she sat down, we were having a get together, and she sat down at the piano and started to play. They didn't have lessons, you know? And whenever my family gathers, it's always about music. You know, food and music, they just go together.
I celebrate that.
And the other thing is laughter.
Yeah.
I come away from gatherings at home just so grounded in what's important. So, you know, get to know us.
Yeah.
Get to know us personally. And beyond that, you know, we have very talented people in our communities. We have artists who are amazing. We have lots of teachers who can teach you. There's courses. There's even a course, Indigenous Canada, that's free. And that's through Coursera, which is, I can't remember which university it is now, but it's out west. And I did the course because I wanted to know what they were teaching. And it's excellent. Yeah. It's you know, there's a limit to what they can teach in the number of weeks they have, but it's good information.
Well, and that goes back to lifelong learning, right? Like,
yeah.
It's not a one and done kind of thing.
Yeah.
It's going to be a journey.
It's going to be a journey. Yeah. And I think it will be revealed in the fullness of time, we say. My girlfriend's daughter works in a retirement village, they call them, right? And she contacted me, and they're celebrating National Indigenous Peoples Day at their village. And she wanted to know if there was an organization, because they're going to do a fundraiser. And was there an organization that I would recommend to donate to? And I had to say Reconciliation Canada, because they do good work. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's lots of organizations. You know, if we look in this area, we have 6 nations close by, and they have a campaign to save the evidence
right.
at their residential school. go and visit
Yeah.
the site of a residential school. I have a list of places that you can go, even like Curve Lake, Six Nations, Crawford Lake. It's a good place. It's a place where they've uncovered an old Iroquois village, and they've tried to rebuild that, and they use it for teaching.
Yeah.
And those are really good places to learn, because you know you're going to get the truth. If you were to, say, go to the Woodlands Cultural Center, which is at Six Nations, they have a very well-done museum there. I've taken my own kids there. I took my mother there, and she found her grandmother's name on the list.
Oh, gosh.
And now what they do is, not only do you have the museum to go through, they have survivors that will share their stories with you. They've done a video of the residential school, because right now we can't get in because they're doing repairs and trying to get it up to snuff. I have been in that residential school, and I tell you, it is alive
Right.
with hurt.
Yeah.
And I could tell you stories that would totally, some of them I have a hard time. I have a hard time with. And the one that I just shared that came out recently was from a 75-year-old survivor of residential schools. And she talked about the day the young girl who one of the priests had impregnated had her baby. And they took that baby and they swathed it in pink blankets and then threw it in the furnace.
Oh, gosh.
And that woman has carried that for all these years. She said, I can't forget the sound. So, do we have healing to do? Do we have work to do? Absolutely. But I have learned without a doubt that we can do it if we do it together.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's why I'm still in the church, because I'm fortunate to be in a diocese where our bishop believes in reconciliation and believes in the hard work that we have ahead of us, and is willing to put that hard work in and encourage all of us to do it. And Bishop Mark has been, Archbishop Mark, I'm so used to calling him Bishop Mark. I remember him at first saying people didn't come much when he started. And I have to say, you know, from my experience, just because I'm Indigenous and somebody else is Indigenous doesn't mean that I can walk into their community and be accepted. We have reason to doubt. So I have very good friends, and friends that I trust, because whether they know it or not, they've been tested. You know what I mean? Because we're, with reason, we're reluctant. We're reluctant to open ourselves up. One, for so many years, nobody paid any attention. Our stories weren't true.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that those threads of listening, learning, teaching, and honesty are, I mean, they've just been woven through everything that you've shared tonight. And we do have a long road ahead. We do have a lot of learning and listening to do, and the truth is coming out. We need to tend to it. I thank you from the bottom of my heart for everything that you have shared tonight, for the laughter and the tears and the things that have been hard to share, and the love that is present in everything that you say, the leadership, the faithful leadership. Thank you for blessing us tonight. And I know that we're having this conversation in a very raw place, a place of grieving, and to speak into that place with love and honesty is a blessing to all of us. So thank you, Val. And thank you to all of those who are with us tonight. We hope that you'll join us in 2 weeks' time on June 30th. We'll be airing at 7 p.m. that night, and we'll be talking with Lorenzo Cromwell that night, a deacon in our church, about his journey as a Christian leader and as a gay man, through the church and through secrecy and shame to honesty and openness and his true identity as a beloved child of God and a leader in our church. So thank you, everyone, for being with us tonight, and thank you. Wow.
In my language, I say Nahwe. Nahwe, thank you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for the hearts that are open here. I'm really grateful for that.
Thank you, Val.
Allies.